Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 7 of the American Pageant titled The Road to Revolution from 1763 to 1775. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it. To start off, here are the key concepts for this chapter. These are located at the beginning of every chapter in the American Pageant. As always, I talk about how I match the key terms to each bullet point after I read the chapter, so you should definitely do that. It will help you organize your information. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about the different ideologies of the time. And this will really bolster the revolutionary spirit within the colonists, so this is definitely important to know about. One thing you should know about is republicanism, the idea that all citizens of a society should give up their selfish interests for the common good. And this contrasts the British philosophy of monarchy and aristocracy, the idea that there's bound to be a top 1% of society. This is saying that everyone is going to provide something to society, and they're not just going to worry about their own selfish needs. And it shows how colonial government depended on this self-sufficiency and civic involvement, which planted ideas against Britain. We talked about before how there were a lot of differences between the colonies and Britain, especially because Britain was having this policy of salutary neglect towards the colonies. For example, the Anglican Church wasn't really that prominent in some areas of the colonies. They had more democratic church affairs, and the colonies also allowed for greater social mobility. It was easier for people who were born into poverty to move into the middle class or beyond compared to Britain. You should also know about the radical Whigs. These were British political commentators who were very popular among the colonists, who feared the threat of liberty posed to by the British monarchy. They're warning their listeners to be wary of corruption and be vigilant in defending their rights. And this again is promoting the idea that the British government was bad. They're saying, be careful, the British government might try to take away your rights, and if they do, you have to go against this. So again, this is planting ideas of resistance within the colonists. And we'll see that as the British try to enforce taxes, however lenient they may be relatively, the colonists will not feel that they are warranted. And a big idea that you should know about, not really relating to republicanism or the radical Whigs, is mercantilism. This was more of a British belief that wealth is power and that a country should import more than it exports. So it's really just focused on money. And any way to get money from the colonies is validated through mercantilism. So essentially, mercantilism was a justification for the colonies. They were a market to sell to at higher prices and buy from at cheaper prices. So the British, in some sense, felt sort of validated in a way exploiting the colonies to maximize their profits. You should also note that Britain wanted to keep their monopoly, so they passed multiple laws prohibiting colonial trade with countries besides Britain, for example, the navigation laws. We also talked about the Molasses Act a couple chapters back, things like that. And there is a little bit of nuance that you should know with the idea of mercantilism. For one, the navigation laws weren't really heavily enforced, so the colonies got away with a lot of smuggling. It's not like these rules were particularly oppressive. They were just a mild annoyance, if anything, and they were easily bypassed for the most part. So the colonists weren't too heavily affected by it. However, the British Crown was allowed to nullify any laws passed by the colonial legislatures that detrimentally affected mercantilism. And this wasn't used very often, but again, colonies were annoyed more by its presence than its actual practice, which we'll see with their opinions regarding a lot of the laws that Britain will pass. And again, the colonies benefited from their relationship with Britain. Britain would pay bounties for colonial ship parts, Virginia Tobacco had a monopoly over Britain, and they were overall protected by the world's strongest navy at no cost until, of course, the French and Indian War, when the British levied taxes on the colonies to pay back their war debt. So let's talk about that. I know you see a t-shirt there, but we'll get to that in a bit. There are many rising tensions as a result of the rising taxes, and although in the British view they weren't that horrible, the colonists felt otherwise. So let's talk about that. For one, you have the Sugar Act of 1764. This was a tax on sugar imported from the West Indies. The tax was eventually lowered, but the resentment still lingered. You also have the Quartering Act in 1765, which required certain colonists to provide food and shelter for British troops. You should also know about the Stamp Act, 1765. This required the use of stamps on most legal documents and bills to certify payment. And this one was especially egregious for the colonists because a lot of things were paper. And to just do certain basic transactions would require a stamp. And having to use a stamp for literally everything was getting very annoying. And one important thing that comes from the Stamp Act is the Virginia Resolves. These were made by Patrick Henry, and it said that you shouldn't have taxation without representation, the famous saying. And the British respond that the colonies have virtual representation, that the members of parliament are representing the colonies' interests, and that this counts as representation. The colonists disagree. They said that direct representation is representation. The colonies need to send a representative that they chose in order to enforce these laws. But obviously this wouldn't really do much either way because the parliamentary members would outvote the colonial representatives, so there wasn't really a solution to this, but they just expressed that sentiment. And as a result of all of this, the colonists feel that they need to gather, they need to discuss these egregious taxes, and this leads to the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. And essentially what happens is 27 colonial delegates meet in New York City to write a statement of their rights and their grievances to the British Crown and ask them to repeal the Stamp Act. This is largely ignored in England, but it's a major step towards colonial unity. Remember, the last time the colonists really met was the Albany Congress, and that was made by Britain. That was not voluntary. So this is a huge step towards really unifying the colonial purpose. And in response to this, Britain passes the Declaratory Act. So the Stamp Act is eventually repealed, and following the repeal of the Stamp Act, it affirmed the right of Parliament to have absolute sovereignty over the colonies. They can essentially do whatever they want, no really rhyme or reason to it. Just the fact that they control the colonies. And you should note that there are two perspectives to this, the British and the colonial perspective. And in terms of the British, they felt like giving the colonies a tax was completely justifiable because they were paying a higher tax for the same amount of protection. And they felt like the colonies were being ungrateful because they weren't even willing to pay for their own protection from the best navy in the world. And it's not even that high of a tax compared to what the British citizens at home had. And again, they're saying that the colony should pay for their own defense, they should show some gratitude for having the world's strongest navy on their side, and they're kind of being resentful towards how the colonies are acting. And in terms of the colonies, they believe that they shouldn't be taxed unless they had direct representation. We talked about this with taxation without representation, but again, this is a very important concept you should definitely know about. They believed that if they didn't have a direct representative, Parliament couldn't possibly represent colonial interests because they don't live there. And again, remember, even if they did get direct representation, British Parliament members would easily outvote them. But in addition to this, the colonies were confused why Britain would need troops stationed in the colonies now that the war was over. Were they trying to control them? Were they trying to prevent any insurrections against the taxes? People were getting suspicious. And they didn't want to pay taxes towards something that could potentially be used against them if it were going that way. So again, you're seeing mounting suspicion from the colonies. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about colonial resistance and more of these taxes and these acts. For one, you should know about the Admiralty Courts. These were where offenders of the Sugar and the Stamp Acts were put to trial without a jury and were guilty until proven innocent. They really didn't have anything going for them. Most of the time they were found guilty, and colonists found that this was especially unfair because since they were being tried in Britain, they were obviously going to be found guilty more often than not. And in order to resist these taxes and these acts, and to really show that they have power over Britain, the colonies adopt something called non-importation agreements. This is where the colonists boycotted British goods, making homemade goods and discouraging habits that the British profited off of. And this really increased colonial resistance and allowed women to play a more active role in society. They began making clothes at home and selling them. So even women became increasingly part of the revolution. Some more resistance is seen with the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. These were groups that enforced the non-importation agreements against violators by tarring and feathering, especially British officials. This was more something that the Sons of Liberty did. Women obviously would be kind of scrutinized for being so violent, but yeah, the Sons would tar and feather British officials and other people who bought things from Britain even after the non-importation agreements, while the Daughters of Liberty again made clothes and sold them, which would discourage people from buying from Britain. And the British again angered the colonists through the Townshend Acts. These were imposed by Charles Townshend and established an import duty on glass, paint, paper, and tea, which the colonists drank daily. And this was especially troublesome because the revenue that would be generated from these acts, from these taxes, would go towards the royal governor's salaries. And eventually, because of the protests, it wasn't very profitable for Britain, and they were actually losing money on it. So they kind of just abandoned it and tried something else. But one turning point you should definitely know about in terms of colonial resistance is the Boston Massacre. On March 5th, 1770, British troops were sent to Boston to control the rebellious colonists, and they are resentful of the Redcoats. They're again resentful that the troops are being stationed in the colonies, maybe sent to control them, to suppress their rebellion, etc. There's a jeering crowd that's gathered near the town hall, and troops are getting angry, they're getting agitated, and it's not exactly clear who started what, but what happens is the troops fire into the crowd, there's a massacre, and the troops were barely punished, which really sparked outrage among the colonists. They really felt like the fact that these officers weren't being punished for their mistreatment of the colonists, regardless of who started it, was completely unfair and unethical. And finally, another way that the colonies resisted is through the Committees of Correspondence. These were created by Sam Adams, and they spread through the colonies to help keep the spirit of resistance alive and continue to defy British policies. It also allowed for a more serious debate over whether or not to take action against the British. To what extent can the colonies take action against the British, their authority, really? And these Committees of Correspondence eventually evolved into the American Congress. So let's talk a little bit more about colonial resistance. One key turning point, again, is the Boston Tea Party. So to provide a little bit of background to the story, the British East India Company is in massive debt from unsold tea, they're facing bankruptcy, and the British government is worried that they could lose a lot of money in tax revenue. So to solve this, the government decides to grant them a monopoly over colonial tea. So the colonies would get cheap tea, and the company would get rid of their debt. But the colonies saw this as manipulation. They felt like the government was again using them, so the protesters prevent the tea from even reaching the port. However, in Massachusetts, Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Boston refuses to give in to the protesters and ensures the tea reaches the port, the harbor. Some colonists, however, retaliate by disguising as Indians and dumping the tea into the harbor. So thousands and thousands of pounds of tea are lost, a lot of revenue is gone, and the British are very upset. And part of their response particularly targets Massachusetts, specifically the Intolerable Acts. These were laws against Massachusetts, specifically the Boston Port Act, which stopped trade and severely hurt the Massachusetts economy. So this is really Britain's way of reprimanding the colonies, teaching them a lesson, hopefully that they won't replicate this mistake, but again, this is only going to fan the flames, and this will make the colonists even more mad than they were to begin with, hence why they are called the Intolerable Acts. This is really showing the colonies that British authority is quite literally intolerable to them. You should also note that during this time, the Quebec Act of 1774 is passed, and essentially this is a British law that gave Quebec more land, up until the Ohio River, I think, and a lot more religious freedom. Colonists mistook this as part of the British response to the Boston Tea Party. They felt like this was part of their punishment, giving some benefits to these people that really the British government doesn't care about that much, and sort of like a message. If the colonists behaved properly, they would also be rewarded. They felt like it was sort of a warning to them. And essentially what happens is these colonial delegates meet to redress grievances in an appeal to the king while considering a more violent route. But they are not calling for independence at all. They are just suggesting that the current situation is not ideal, something needs to change, and exactly what that is still unclear. However, it is super important to note that as time goes on, the colonists will stop seeing complete independence as a radical option, but rather the only option. Obviously, there will still be loyalists who will be loyal to Britain to the very end, but more and more people are siding with the Patriots, siding with independence, as British authorities are more and more oppressive. And finally, you have the association. This is another form of resistance in the colonies. It called for a complete boycott of British goods. So they're not importing, they're not exporting, and they're not consuming it. So this is an extension, really, of the non-importation agreements. And so really, as a result of all this, the colonies are sort of starting to get a little more violent, and this is really going to mark the start of the war. First, you have the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. The British troops are sent to seize the colonial gunpowder and capture the leaders of the rebellion, particularly Sam Adams and John Hancock. However, the colonial Minutemen fight back, some colonists die, and it marks the official start of the war. It wasn't meant to be a battle, technically, but it happened and the colonies fought back. They realized that they do have some power, and so the war starts. And this person isn't particularly relevant at the moment, but you should definitely know about Marquis Lafayette. He was a rich French soldier who fought for the colonies during the American Revolution, and his family influence and political connections were valuable in getting foreign aid from France later in the war, which again we will talk about in later chapters, but just know about him. Moving on, you have Valley Forge in 1775. George Washington leads the colonial soldiers in a southern campaign as they suffered from a lack of food and clothes during the incredibly harsh winter. And the fact that George Washington is able to lead them in such a distressing time really shows the leadership advantage that the colonies had over the British. You should also note that many were poorly trained to fight, so George Washington brings in Baron von Steuben to help train the soldiers and become more competent in their fighting. And finally, you have the camp followers. These were women who were paid to follow the colonial army by cooking, sewing, and providing first aid when someone was hurt, essentially serving as nurses. And this really shows how women were just as involved in the war effort as men. I feel like sometimes that kind of doesn't come up as much, but women were definitely still part of it. Obviously, they couldn't do as much as men because it wasn't seen as socially acceptable to, go outside of the homemaking sphere, which we'll definitely talk about in the future. That's going to continue to be a problem for generations, but now women are getting a little bit more freedom because it's ultimately helping the cause of the colonies. And finally, let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each side, of the British and the colonies. So let's start with the British, particularly what they had going for them and what the colonies didn't have going for them. So for one, they had a stronger navy and a military, and they also had a more established economy. Remember, the colonial economy was heavily reliant on Britain, so the colonies don't really have that. And additionally, they don't have a navy at all, really, and their military is lackluster at best, but Baron von Steuben, when he trains the soldiers, will definitely help with alleviating that. You should also note that there are still many loyalists in the colonies, and loyalists obviously were people who were loyal to Britain and opposed the revolution. They wanted to stay with Britain, and they didn't really feel like entire independence was necessary to get what they wanted. But unfortunately, Britain doesn't really use them. They made up a considerable amount of the population in the colonies, a solid 16%, so really not utilizing them was kind of a fault of the British. And finally, this is more of a colonial con, but the Continental Congress was really just a body that people would consult with. There wasn't really any authority to impose rules. There were just ideas, and those ideas would eventually be implemented, but no one could really force anyone to do anything else. So now let's move on to the colonial pros and the British cons. One major advantage that the colonies had was that this was a fight on their homeland. They were familiar with the land, so they were able to use guerrilla warfare to make up for their lack of arms and a stronger navy. You should also note that they have a sense of purpose. There's this patriotic cause in hopes for a better future. They've felt like they aren't being represented by Britain, and they know that they can't let that happen again. So again, there's this purpose. They know that they want this. So although it's not looking particularly good for them at the moment, there's still this idea of a better future that's really propelling their cause. You should also note that they have a vigilant military leadership, specifically George Washington. He is the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and he does a really good job of training the soldiers. And finally, there's eventual aid from France after the Battle of Saratoga. Again, we'll talk about all of that later, but essentially the alliance with France really allows them to get more weapons and eventually win their independence from Britain. Okay, that'll do it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us out and lets us know that this video was helpful for you so that we can make videos in the future.